Hi there and welcome to this video lecture for philosophy. And in this video lecture we're going to be talking about Confucius, or as is known in the West, Confucius. Confucius is the Latinized version of his name. Confucius means literally Grandmaster Kong, and he was a philosopher in ancient China between the 6th and the 5th centuries BCE, before the Common Era. So about 2,600 years ago, Confucius or Confucius was an active thinker, and he's had an immense influence on the development of China as a country and its system of bureaucracy and government. His thinking has been immensely influential over the past 2,500 years. So we're going to be looking at his account in the Analects of human nature and ethics, and try and get a sense of some of the main themes before we get into the views of a couple of his disciples next week. We'll look at Mencius and Sun Tzu, two of the kind of followers of Confucius in later centuries. But let's get a sense in this lecture of some of the main themes of Confucius thought. So the text that we're using is a part of the Analects, the text called the Analects, and it's a collection of Confucius's sayings that was written down by his followers probably a long while after his death, and was edited over centuries. So it's not written directly by Confucius, but it gives us an idea of some of the themes and some of the ideas that were central to his thought. There are a number of other texts that he wrote as well, but this is sort of a main that he's associated with, but this is a main sort of text for understanding his philosophy. What we learn from the text then are a number of themes that help us to make sense of Confucius' response to the problems of China during what's called the Warring States period. As we'll see, this was a period of a kind of breakdown of order and a return to a kind of tribal warfare that had seemed to be surpassed in Chinese history. So it's a kind of regression, and Confucius is writing and responding to this sense of regression, and sort of responding to that sense of sort of decay. So we'll get a sense of where that comes from. Okay, so Confucius lived 551 to 479, about 2,600 years ago. And in his time, the country had splintered into small, independent and often warring states, ruled over by feudal lords whose authority was maintained by laws, punishment and force, rather than through moral behavior and general concern for the welfare of the people. So there was a sense for Confucius that this was a kind of decline, that something had been lost here in this period where where authority was basically just about laws, punishment, but no kind of genuine feeling of unity, or no sort of feeling of the value of the law. So Confucius looked back to this golden age that he thought was now lost. And that was the age of the Zhou dynasty, which defeated the Shang rulers in about 1030 BCE. The Zhou dynasty began to decline after the Western Zhou capital was conquered by actually non-Chinese enemies in 771 BCE. So that's kind of the end, of the age of the Zhou dynasty. And as the system decayed, this new regime of local warlords looking out for their own interests developed. So Confucius is looking back to the role of what he calls the sage kings, the wise rulers, who became a model for him and what he calls in the Analects the Yun Si. So in Confucius's writing, the Zhensi, the Yunsi, the sort of gentleman or exemplary man, the noble character, is always opposed to the Xiao Ren, the petty man or the small-minded person. So this is the sort of moral exemplar for Confucius, the Yunsi, the person who provides a kind of moral exemplar for others to follow. So in this period, then, the harmony of the Zhou period had been lost. Laws and human impulses had now become at odds. There was no kind of impulse or sort of feeling for the law. Those two things had become separated. Now, for Confucius, an important part of recovering what's been lost concerns ritual. But first we have to get clear, before we talk about that, we have to get clear on what ritual is and how it works. And I think we usually talk about ritual in three sort of main ways, right? We have rituals in a kind of religious, spiritual context, baptism, funerals, sort of other kind of actions like the sign of the cross. Kneeling can be a kind of ritual, a religious act. And then we've got ritual as meaning something like habit, so something we do. So we might say we have a ritual to take a walk in the afternoon, we have this sort of ritual walk that we take. We have a ritual of drinking tea in the evening. So we often describe it in a way that's sort of like habit. We have a morning ritual that we follow. We do the sort of same actions in the same order. So we often sort of think about it like that. Now, we also talk about empty ritual when we make a rote or insincere response. This is kind of revealing, I think. When someone asks how we are, let's say, which happens on a daily basis, we greet people with "how are you?" and suppose we say "I'm fine," even though we're not. So that would be an example of a sort of rote or insincere response, when we're just kind of rote going through the ritual without really thinking about what it's doing, what it's saying. In Confucius's time, there were rituals of ancestor veneration, which involved a whole load of prescriptions about what utensils to use, how to employ them, words to say, that kind of thing. So those were kind of an important part of ritual for Confucius's time. How you venerate ancestors by sort of doing the ritual in the right way, using the right words, etc. But there was also sort of noble etiquette, which is about showing respect to people of different ranks. For Confucius, as we'll see, the essential thing about ritual is it's the outer expression of an inner morality. So that's why when we talk about empty ritual, it's interesting because it's as though ritual has become divorced from its kind of morality. It's become simply this sort of outer shell that's separated from the things that would make it sincere or feeling and everything else. So that can happen to ritual over time, and of course that's part of Confucius's sense of what's gone wrong in the era in which he's talking, that there's come about this sort of emptying of ritual of meaning, that people just go through the motions but don't really have feeling, don't really care about what they're doing. So ritual performance, performing a ritual is about a moral action. It's doing something moral that shows the proper respect for people in different social situations. That's why ritual is important. Ritual is about social respect. It's about how we treat other people morally. So it's not just about fulfilling sort of social rules. It's not just about doing things because that's the way they've always been done. It's about showing sort of moral respect for other people and showing that you're the kind of person that can engage in social relationships in a respectful and sort of morally sensitive way. All right, let's talk about some examples so we can see what that means and how it might work. Let's suppose you say, "Hi, how are you?" as we all do on a daily basis. But your friend in this case doesn't respond or simply says, "I'm fine," without asking how you are. So we know saying "how are you" it's not really a request for information, right? The main point of saying it is not to request information about how someone is. We might think of it as a way of showing respect, right? It's similar to offering to shake someone's hand. It's as though we're recognizing them as sort of worthy of concern. And that's why when we offer this, when we say, "Hi, how are you?" it's polite for people to respond and then say, "Well, how are you?" Because there's a reciprocity to the ritual. There's a commonness. We both have to sort of respond and play the game. When that reciprocity isn't offered, when someone says "I'm fine" without saying "and how are you doing," it's as though the ritual breaks down and we might feel disrespected. Right? We might feel that we've done our part to recognize the other person's humanity, but they haven't sort of recognized ours in the same way. And so disrespect comes from failure to observe the ritual or to observe it in a sort of in a fulfilled kind of way, in a way that properly fulfills what the ritual demands. Think about an example too. Think about the ritual of queuing in line. Again, something that we're all very familiar with, I think. That queuing, we'd rather sort of, we might want to get to the front of the queue, but we queue in line to show respect for everybody else who is waiting. So to ignore the ritual by cutting the line is disrespectful to everybody else who is waiting. So again, the ritual allows us to respect one another. It allows us to show respect for everybody else by waiting our turn, by letting other people who were there first go before us. So again, the ritual is about respect and treating other people morally, treating other people as equals that deserve to be respected. And thirdly, I think we could think about classroom rituals. Think about in a classroom how people tend to occupy the same seats, creatures of habit, of course. Once we have a sort of place, we tend to return to that place on subsequent occasions. Also, people will sort of be doing things in the class, but generally, when the teacher starts talking and starts the class, people generally stop and listen. Generally, generally that's what happens. And again, those things are again ways of marking respect. We're respectful of other people's space, so we only want to occupy our seats in our particular space, and we sort of repeat that when we return to the classroom. So ritual is a way, we might think of ritual as a way of teaching us proper behavior, and I think that's how Confucius thinks about it as well. Although it is possible for us to act in rituals in a way that is rote or unfeeling, Confucius argues that ritual should be an expression of our inner feelings. And often when we act in a sort of rote or unfeeling way, we're coming close to disrespect. We're risking disrespecting the people that we are sharing the ritual with. So ritual should channel our emotion. It's allowing that emotion to be expressed in morally positive ways. So why do things decay, or what are the sort of causes of that? So I think for Confucius there are two sides, and they reflect this basic idea that there's a kind of inner component to ritual, and there's also an outer component. And the inner component is human nature, right? So one source of moral decay is that basic human weakness or vices. We become envious, we become selfish, we're lazy, we're dishonest, we're stingy. All of those things are part of our nature. All of those things may become prominent, and that makes it hard for us to act in the way that ritual requires. It makes it hard for us to see, to participate properly in ritual and to take pleasure in doing it. On the other hand, the sort of outer aspect of ritual, the quality of traditional culture, that may itself have become corrupted. So rituals might not be what they once were. Then we no longer identify with them. The cultural forms have decayed. So essentially, we can look at it in this way as a sort of outer problem of how the sort of practices, the rituals have decayed, or we can look at it as an inner problem. But the two problems are related. The two problems are two sides of the same thing. So there's an inner component of how we feel, our emotions, or the joy we take in doing things, and the outer components are the cultural forms in which we act. So both of these have become decayed or corrupted, and they no longer work together. So we can think of one example here that we can think of is, say, a funeral, right, where in a funeral it gives the sort of cultural form, allows us to sort of express our sorrow and what the deceased person meant to us. So it allows us to express our emotions in this sort of positive, meaningful kind of moral way. So when things are working together, the outer cultural form is allowing that emotion to being expressed, and it's giving it form and substance. So if, for example, if we didn't have funerals, people might sort of tear their hair out, they might tear their clothes, they might throw themselves on the deceased person. But those are less less socially refined ways of sort of expressing your emotions. They don't allow us the same sort of sense of moral dignity in expressing our emotions. But a funeral, because of the way it's structured, because of the form that it gives to our emotions, it allows us to express them in a kind of healthy and a kind of substantive way that brings them out in this positive way that allows us to sort of get on with our lives afterwards. So when it works well, it brings those two elements together. When it's decayed or corrupted, the feeling part, in this case our sort of our pain and our suffering and our sorrow, and the ritual part, the cultural form, they no longer work together. They no longer the form no longer provides a place for our emotions to be expressed in a kind of worthy way. So this is what happens when inner and outer are severed. Without the unity of feeling and ritual, society simply focuses on obtaining external goods and forgets about cultivating goodness. People carry out the rituals and traditions mechanically, but without the genuine feeling that should be part of the performance. And we can get a sense of this from Confucius' comment in the Analects in section 2.3. If people are led by law and restrained by punishments, they will try to avoid them without any sense of shame, he says. If they are led by virtue and restrained by propriety, they will have a sense of shame and become good. So notice this is the situation that Glaucon offers us, a situation where everybody's simply focused on themselves and the pursuit of their own external goods, but there's no kind of connection, no emotional connection to the law and doing things for the sake of the good of the whole. So this, for Confucius, this is the situation where moral cultivation has been lost. The only thing that's left to constrain people, because they don't have a sense of shame, they don't have the right feelings, the only thing left that can constrain people is punishing them. But the problem is, because people don't feel the punishment as shameful, they simply try to avoid getting caught. Or we know nowadays, if they're wealthy, they might sort of employ a whole army of lawyers to try and sort of get them off the punishment, to try and get them declared innocent. So in all these kinds of ways, we might sort of all that we're doing is trying to avoid getting caught, but we don't feel the violation as a sense of shame, because the inner part, our feeling, our emotion, has become divorced from the outer part, the sort of prescription of what we're supposed to do. So the impulse to want to be good has to come from inside. It has to be deeply felt. And when that's no longer the case, then these two things, they're no longer working together, and ritual or law becomes empty. Now, Confucius tells us that the person of moral character is a person who possesses Ren. And that's the main kind of virtue in Confucius's understanding. You might think of a virtue as a kind of trait of character. It's a kind of character trait that allows somebody to act in these constant sort of habitual ways. So an example might be courage or wisdom. Somebody possessed of the virtue of courage might always act in certain ways, always avoid certain sorts of actions. It's a sort of permanent trait of their character. Same with somebody, say, who possesses wisdom. So how do we sort of develop this virtue of Ren? How do we become Ren? For Confucius, we develop it in these 5 relationships. And the 5 relationships are relationships of father and son, ruler and subject, husband and wife, elder brother, younger brother, and friend and friend. Now we might notice that with the exception of the last one, these relationships are characterized by hierarchy. They're not equal relationships, with the exception of friend-friend. Right? So the son has obligations to the father. The father is able to instruct the son, but it's not an equal relationship. Ren for Confucius is something that we exercise in relationships with others. And we can see this on the symbol Ren that we can see here on the right hand side. And the symbol for Ren is composed of 2 characters in Chinese. It's composed of the character for man, and it's composed of the character for 2. So it suggests relationships. It suggests people in relationships. And for Confucius, the family and the sort of relationships that we find there is the training ground for morality. How do we learn to be moral? We learn it by learning what we need to do and how we need to behave in these different relationships. This is where we learn the traits of character that are necessary to become a cultivated moral person. So that's the importance of filial piety. We can note it's mostly Confucius living in a very patriarchal society. It's mostly focused on males, and the sort of the brother to brother relationship is favored, and that's a feature of the sort of patriarchal society in which Confucius is writing. But I don't think we have to accept that those are the only sort of relationships that count today, when we don't share the same sort of patriarchal assumptions that were common in Confucius' time. All right, so filial piety is about showing respect, obedience, and care for one's parents and family. And for Confucius, it's the building block of moral learning. It can also mean treating elders and ancestors with respect. And indeed, before Confucius, the idea of filial piety was centered on veneration of ancestors, how to fulfill the rites, how to venerate the ancestors with sacrifices and so on. Confucius focused more on our obligations to the living, so he makes filial piety less about the ancestors and more about living and more about the relationships among people currently alive. Filial piety became a moral concept rather than a traditional one, based on the sort of natural ties of affection, such as the love between parents and children. So it's through filial piety that we learn the traits of moral character that will stand us in good stead in the world. So, moral cultivation in a fallen world, for Confucius, there are two main elements of how we cultivate ourselves. And the first is ritual practice, or li. By perfecting ritual practice, Confucius thinks the student internalizes ideal forms of behavior in various life situations. And secondly, by learning, by reading, in throwing ourselves into learning, modeling the thoughts and deeds of the ancient exemplars. The idea of harmony is important here as well, because ritual regulates our emotions and allows for their proper expression. Our feelings are brought into harmony with the forms in which they are outwardly expressed. So through this sort of moral cultivation, we're trying to bring about this idea of harmony. And that shows us the importance of music. On Confucius's view, we might think of music as a kind of harmony of the kind of the sound and the sort of the physical instrument, making the sound and the idea that we want to express. So it has the same kind of inner and outer sort of structure as ritual. Okay, so let's take a look at Confucius's model of moral cultivation, and this is a selection of text that he gives us in the Analects. He says, "At 15 I had my mind bent on learning. At 30 I stood firm. At 40 I had no doubts. At 50 I knew the decrees of heaven. At 60 my ear obeyed truth. At 70 I could follow what my heart desired without transgressing what was right." Now, if we look at this carefully, I think we'll see three stages here that he's identifying. And the first stage is a commitment to the Confucian way, submitting to study and ritual practice until you've internalized all the requirements, until, like he says, he can stand firm. So the first one is sort of immersing himself in learning, immersing himself in practice until he's sort of got a handle on the requirements, until he knows what he's required to do. And then in the second stage, he begins to feel at ease in this way of doing things and sees how this fits into the plan of heaven. He says, I had no doubts. And he sees how things fit into the broader purpose of things. And in the final stage, the inner feelings and sentiments have been so harmonized with the demands of ritual practice that we do them spontaneously from the pure joy of doing them. At 70, Confucius says, I could follow what my heart desires without transgressing what was right. So at 70, Confucius simply does what is right by following what his heart desires. So moral action at this stage, it's not work or struggle. It's not like we have to fight our impulses. Everything is effortless. Everything is natural. And it arises effortlessly out of the nature of the self. The nature of the self is one that's been cultivated so that it wants to do the right thing, and it wants to do the moral thing. So doing that is not work or struggle. It's simply behaving in a spontaneous, effortless way. So this brings us to an important concept in Confucius thought. It's this idea of wu wai, what we can think of as acting effortlessly, spontaneously, without struggle. Confucius says, this is in section 618, those who know the way aren't equal to those who love it, and those who love it aren't equal to those who delight in it. So it's not just knowing the right thing, it's about how we feel about doing the right thing. It's about our entire being is kind of harmonized on knowing that this is the right thing and feeling that this is the right thing. So the virtuous person should be fully at ease and natural when they act. Nothing is forced, nothing is coerced. Everything should flow naturally from one's feelings. And those feelings find perfect expression in the frames of ritual that allow us to act out those moral feelings. So for Confucius, having the right attitude and feelings is as important as doing the right thing. Our feelings should be harmonized perfectly with the ritual forms in which they are expressed. So again, think of the funeral, where those ritual forms allow us to express our sorrow, our suffering, and it just, all of that sort of feeling just flows naturally into the sort of framework of the funeral ritual when we're in it. An intellectual understanding of the rites is not enough. We can't just see them as knowledge or know them intellectually. Their requirements must be completely harmonized with our person and our emotions. We must take joy in doing the right thing. This is why we can't say that people are Ren simply based on what they do or what they have done. It's not just about what we do, it's about the harmony of inner and outer that makes a person Ren. It's about doing things naturally, spontaneously, with a perfectly natural flow. This allows for a great amount of subtlety and flexibility when acting, because we're never just going through the motions, we're always sort of adjusting it based on what we feel and how that's related to what we're doing. Every action becomes like a virtuoso music performance, in that we're seeking for a harmony between the physical exterior and the inner desire for expression. And those two things have to become perfectly harmonized. So it's like when we're acting, we're trying to be these kind of virtuoso experts, just like a musician, trying to bring about this perfect expression of feeling in this physical frame. So an important element of being able to do this comes out of this idea of the Confucian, what's called the silver rule, or shu. And we can see that in this passage from the Analects, where Confucius says, "The master said, when you travel, act as if you were receiving a great guest. Employ the people as if you were assisting at a great sacrifice. Don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself. Then no one in the country or in your family will complain about you." So this idea, don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself, that's shu, or the silver rule. It's often compared with what's called the golden rule in Christianity, and which the golden rule has a more positive formulation in that it says, do to others what you would want them to do to you. Here we see in the silver rule it has more of a kind of more of a negative formulation. Don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself. But it suggests this idea of a capacity for empathy or sympathetic understanding in acting. That in dealing with others, we're obliged to treat them as we would wish to be treated. We have to put ourselves in their place and uncover their feelings and emotions that we would be going through in that situation. So that's the characteristic of empathy. And sometimes empathy doesn't come easily. And that's really the difficulty of living up to this Confucian vision. That it's often hard to have empathy for the annoying neighbor, the distracted teacher, the exhausted colleague. This is something we have to work at constantly. Always trying to be present with our feelings, searching out what we would feel in another's situation. So it suggests a kind of flexibility in carrying out our obligations. Our understanding of what is required must be informed by our cultivated sense of what others are feeling and how they will be affected. Our performance of our duties must reflect this sense of what is at stake in human terms. So we get this sense again of us being like virtuosos, that we're always kind of trying to sense what other people might be feeling in that situation and how to adjust what we're doing on that basis. So we're always sort of trying to learn more about what other people are feeling, what's the right sort of attitude, what's the right sort of focus in this situation. So it's a constant sort of ongoing work of trying to find out what the appropriate thing to do is. Okay, so we've seen in this lecture that Confucius believes in a reciprocal relationship between humanity or humaneness and ritual. Ritual allows our humanity to be expressed, and it's humaneness or benevolence, the idea of Ren, that animates the performance of ritual. And this is the unity of inner and outer. Feeling and sentiment must be harmonized with what ritual requires of us. As we saw, when we master the joyful performance of ritual, when everything is natural and spontaneous, and our feelings sort of naturally flow into the frame of ritual, we achieve effortless action, or wu wai. A society based solely on law and punishment emerges only when this unity of inner and outer has been destroyed. And that's the contrast we're seeing this week with Glaucon's view. So I'm looking forward to seeing your contributions to the markup and the VoiceThread tasks this week. And don't forget, there's a quiz to complete by the end of the week as well.